Clearly, I'm a major fan of JRPGs, considering the fact that I have a whole channel dedicated to this video game genre. The amount of lore building, side quests, innovative gameplay mechanics, beautiful soundtracks, and emotional and impactful stories are just a few reasons why I absolutely love this genre. Despite saying that though, trying to make time to play as many JRPGs as possible is easier said than done. That's because while JRPGs might be one of my favorite types of games to play, they are also the longest types of games to enjoy. Especially when you start diving into the side content of each game, and let's be real, it's kind of hard to avoid the side content of a JRPG. These games are just that good. Still, not everybody has time to play 50 to 60 hour long games each time they sit in front of their TV. So on today's episode of Fantasy Kingdom, I'll be giving you guys 10 incredible JRPGs that you can complete in less than 15 hours. Yeah, if you know anything about JRPGs, then you know that a 15-hour long game in this genre is very rare indeed. For the record, each of the games that appear on today's list, I've personally played, beat, and completed the main story in less than 15 hours. That being said, that's only if you focus on the main story of the game, so keep that in mind when taking a look at today's list. But before we get started, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more JRPG content. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Fantasy Kingdom, and this is 10 incredible JRPGs that take less than 15 hours to complete. Let's get it. Number 10, Dragon Quest 9 Hours. Now, the first Dragon Quest game is technically part of a trilogy in which this game takes place after the third game, in which it follows a descendant of Erdrick. The characters were a bit one-dimensional compared to later entries, and the game didn't feature any groundbreaking features like later entries would. Regardless, the first Dragon Quest is still a fun experience for those that appreciate classic turn-based JRPGs that follow an adventure on a long and dangerous journey to save the world. Plus, this game will be getting an HD 2D remake later this year, and if it's anything as good as the one that we got for Dragon Quest 3, then it might actually be worth waiting until that version releases later this year to experience not only this game, but the next game in the series as well, Dragon Quest 2. And while the original version of this game took around 9-ish hours for me to complete, something tells me with different difficulties added and control over random encounters, something that we saw in HD 2D remake of Dragon Quest 3, that the remake of Dragon Quest 1 later this year can clock in at even a shorter time than the original did for me. Number 9, Final Fantasy Pixel Remastered, 12 hours. Speaking of remasters and remakes of classic JRPGs, the original Final Fantasy, along with 5 of its sequels, got a Pixel Remaster collection a few years back that allowed fans of the series to experience the games that ultimately created one of the most iconic JRPG franchises of all time. Of those games, the first game of the series, Final Fantasy, clocks in at the shortest time to complete with a whopping 12-hour completion time. Now, I know How Long to Be has this game taking closer to 15 to 16 hours to complete, but I personally recorded all of my gameplay footage for Final Fantasy and it clocks in at around 12 hours or so for my first playthrough. Regardless, this game is easily one of the shortest entries of the entire series, and it's not hard to see why. Unlike other entries that feature a second world to explore or an extremely long story, Final Fantasy 1 is pretty straightforward. As the 4 Guardians of Light, you must travel and collect all of the elemental orbs, travel back in time, get through the last dungeon of the game that features all of the different bosses you beat once already, and then face the final boss of the game. That's pretty much the entire story in a nutshell. Still, while the story in this game is definitely not the most exciting, exploring the world of the first Final Fantasy game was one of the best JRPG experiences back in the day, and it was this iconic turn-based JRPG that began Square's journey in developing one of the most popular franchises of all time. Number 8, Koudelka, 13 hours. Koudelka is an easily forgotten JRPG, and that kinda sucks considering what this game did for the genre. See, horror games and JRPGs are just two genres that rarely cross over with each other, which is kind of unfortunate considering some of my favorite JRPGs out there are horror focused ones like this game and others that you may or may not see later on today's list. Anyway, Koudelka is one of your more traditional turn-based JRPGs with horror elements to it, and it was this game that inspired a much better horror JRPG franchise, Shadow Hearts. The game follows 3 characters that end up inside of a medieval monastery in which horrifying looking monsters have taken residence up in, and each character, for different reasons and circumstances, team up to investigate the dark history behind this building. Koudelka combines traditional turn-based JRPG mechanics with traits seen in classic survival horror games, including limited resources and puzzle solving, something that you'll see later on with another entry on today's list. While the gameplay is definitely a bit clunky and it could definitely take some time to get used to it, the story and the cutscenes are truly out of this world, and it's definitely worth a playthrough if you're a horror fan that's into JRPGs, especially considering that this game only takes around 13 hours to complete. Number 7, Super Mario RPG, 12 hours. Until recently, this JRPG was a hidden gem on the Nintendo 64. However, thanks to the recent remake of it, Super Mario RPG has finally gotten the love and attention that it deserves. While Mario games have come in the form of JRPGs courtesy of other entries like the Paper Mario series, Super Mario RPG is without a doubt my favorite JRPG in the Mario franchise. And that really shouldn't be too surprising considering that the developers behind the original game was Square Enix. You know, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Chrono Trigger, yeah, that's Square Enix. Obviously, the story was much different than most Mario games, with even the villain moving away from Bowser and instead focusing on a brand new villain, King Smithy. Super Mario RPG is basically characters from the Mario universe teaming up with Square's original characters, like fan favorite Chino the Puppet. This turn-based JRPG remake took me around 12 hours to complete, which I highly recommend to both fans of JRPGs and Super Mario. Number 6, Ys: The Oath to Felghana, 12 hours long. The Ys franchise is slowly catching up to the Final Fantasy franchise in terms of the number of mainline entries of the series. As one of the only action JRPG franchises on today's list, Ys follows Adol, an adventurer traveling around the world and going on many different adventures throughout his life. With the exception of one game of the series, each game of this iconic franchise focuses on one of the many adventures that Adol goes on. In the case of this game, Adol and his best friend Dogi travels back to Dogi's hometown only to find that monsters have begun appearing recently. Adol must investigate the island, battle different monsters using a combat system that kind of reminds me of classic Zelda games, and uncover the mystery of what's causing all of these monsters to appear out of nowhere. The great thing about the Ys franchise is that each entry of the series is basically a standalone story outside of a few references to other games, and while later entries will take much longer to complete, earlier entries of the series, like this one, will only take around 11 hours to beat. And even if you add in this side quest on top of that, you can still probably get through this game at around 13 to 15 hours. And with one of the better stories of the series, complete with one of my favorite soundtracks of the franchise, the Oath to Felghana is a great JRPG to play that won't take weeks for you to beat. Number 5, Cosmic Star Heroine, 12 hours. There's technically 2 games on today's list that are not really JRPGs thanks to the fact that they weren't developed by a Japanese studio. However, both of these games are heavily inspired by JRPGs and feature all sorts of traits and characteristics that you would expect in most JRPGs, so I decided to feature them on today's list regardless of that fact. Anyway, in the case of Cosmic Star Heroine, we get a futuristic sci-fi JRPG with both traditional turn-based mechanics and its own unique features. For example, unlike most JRPGs out there, each playable character can only use an ability once during combat, after which they'll need to wait for that same ability to charge before they can use it again. So why is that important? Well, it changes up the status quo for traditional JRPGs. Did you ever find yourself using this same ability or spell over and over again, fight after fight? Well, with this mechanic, you're actually forced to use different abilities and come up with new strategies to beat every enemy you come across. Again, this is a Western developed role-playing game, but the spirit of a JRPG is here, and for that reason, it deserves a spot as one of the better JRPGs out there with a completion time of 12 hours. Number 4, Parasite Eve 2, 13 hours. While Parasite Eve 2 does feature less JRPG elements than its predecessor, it's still a JRPG, even if it does lean more towards action JRPG instead of the traditional JRPG mechanics seen in the first game. Considering that this game was developed by Square Enix though, well, Squaresoft at the time, the JRPG mechanics of the game shouldn't be doubted in the slightest. This 13-hour long story follows protagonist Aya Brea, who now uses her supernatural abilities to hunt down monsters for the government. This brings her to an old motel located in the southwest of the United States, in which she has to once again fight terrifying monsters while also uncovering the mystery around what's causing these monsters to appear. Like Koudelka, Parasite Eve 2 is a horror JRPG, which is something that the genre has been missing lately, as horror JRPGs are a rare combination of genres. And because of limited resources and puzzle solving, Parasite Eve 2 leans even more heavily towards survival horror, making it more rare than traditional horror JRPGs. The game doesn't use turn-based mechanics like most JRPGs on today's list, but it does have a leveling system for Aya's abilities that gets stronger as you collect and use experience points on each of her powers. Personally, I actually prefer this game over the first game of the series, but that's just because I'm a bigger fan of survival horror over JRPG. For the record, my first and main channel outside of Fantasy Kingdom focuses completely on survival horror Resident Evil, so there you have it. Number 3, Child of Light, 11 hours. The other game on this list that is technically not a JRPG is Child of Light. Although this game was developed by a French dev team, Child of Light has just about everything you could ask for when it comes to your typical turn-based JRPG, but delivered to you in a brand new way. See, the most exciting element of Child of Light is the visuals of the game itself, making it one of the most unique looking JRPGs of all time thanks to the watercolor aesthetics. As for the gameplay, it reminds me a lot of Grandia in terms of the combat, or in terms of exploring the world outside of combat, but complete with its own unique style. The story is inspired by fairy tales, but a much darker and somber setting that follows Aurora, who wakes up in Lemuria, a dreamlike world with creatures of all kinds based on your favorite fairy tales. The soundtrack does a great job at setting the mood, which most of the time is a sad and depressing mood to help fit the dark story that the game revolves around. Yeah, the combat might be the most addicting aspect of it, as you'll need to use elemental attacks to take advantage of your opponent's weaknesses, complete with some really cool animations. It's one of those indie games I think deserves a lot more attention than it gets, and with it only taking around 11 hours to complete, there's really no reason why you shouldn't at least try Child of Light at least once in your life to see if it has a big impact on you like it did for me. Number 2, Ys Origin, 11 hours. Remember when I said that the Ys franchise follows Adol in just about every single game with the exception of one? Well, here's that one. Yeah, Ys Origin is the only game of the entire franchise that doesn't follow Adol, as it takes place 700 years before Adol's in the picture. Despite that though, Origin is without a doubt one of my favorite entries of the series. The game follows 3 different protagonists, each with their own unique experience that basically motivates the player to play through the game all 3 times. That being said, if you're just looking for a one and done JRPG that'll clock in at around 11 hours to complete, then your first playthrough of the game should meet that requirement. Everything I said about the Oath To Felghana earlier qualifies here as well, except it's all done better. Because this is the last game to feature this style of gameplay, you'll get the best of everything that earlier entries of the Ys franchise has to offer. Again, it kind of feels like your old school Legend of Zelda dungeon crawler, but complete with more creative boss fights. Actually, the boss fights in this game are not only some of the best in the entire series, but man, they might very well be some of the best boss fights in all JRPGs, period. The combat in the game is extremely addicting, and out of every game on this list, I find myself revisiting this game more than any other just because of how fun the gameplay side of things are with this game. Of course, it helps that the 3 characters that you play as each feel vastly different from each other, making the game feel like a new experience despite it being your second or third playthrough of Origin. Number 1, Parasite Eve, 9 hours. Now I'll admit, this might be my personal bias for horror games playing a part in this decision, but what can I say, survival horror and JRPGs just mix so damn well. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, how I personally prefer Parasite Eve 2, mainly due to the fact that it leans more towards survival horror, and I stand by that. But if I'm looking at what's a better JRPG of the 2 games, then the first game definitely fits that title a little better. That's because whereas the second game leans towards survival horror, the first Parasite Eve game has a lot more elements of traditional JRPG mechanics. While not technically turn-based, there is a meter that fills up that allows you to do one of multiple different actions. So in a way, it does have a form of turn-based mechanics in it, although it is a little different thanks to the fact that the player can move Aya around during this time to dodge attacks. The upgrade and leveling up system also feels more like your traditional JRPG compared to the second game. Whereas that game, the player mostly focuses on using points to upgrade the level of different powers, the first game has a much more traditional upgrade system that unlocks new things as Aya gets stronger. All in all, the first Parasite Eve is just a better JRPG game, while Parasite Eve 2 is the better survival horror game. Then when you combine those elements with the extremely interesting 9-hour long story and the incredible soundtrack, it's no wonder why this game claims the title for best short JRPG in my book. But that does it for this episode of Fantasy Kingdom. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Are there any incredible yet short JRPGs that I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below, as I'm sure that both myself and other viewers would love to find more JRPGs to play that don't require us to set aside 30+ hours to complete. Again, not that I'm complaining, but sometimes it's just nice to enjoy a quick and fun JRPG, you know? Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more JRPG content. Also, leave a like in today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Fantasy Kingdom. Take care.